Welcome to the History section. Today we're beginning a detailed examination of Iron Age Britain, specifically focusing on that really pivotal century just before the Claudian invasion in AD 43.
Right.
The objective here is to build a precise portrait of the island's inhabitants.
And to do that, we have to integrate, well, a few different kinds of evidence. We have the classical historical accounts, of course, but we also have to bring in the critical findings from archaeology and numismatic analysis.
The coins, right, because we're not just charting a period of simple tribal independence here. This is a phase of profound and, as it turns out, ultimately fatal political transformation.
Exactly. And to really grasp the political developments of the first century AD, we have to first establish the ethnic and linguistic baseline of the island.
Where did these people come from?
Well, the Celtic peoples, from a linguistic perspective, they belong to that vast Indo-European family of nations. The linguistic relationships are actually quite instructive.
How so?
Their kinship is demonstrably closest to Latin. They share certain grammatical structures, some foundational vocabulary. On the other hand, the link to the Teutonic languages is, well, it's comparatively narrow.
And the widest gap?
That would be with the eastern branch of the family, specifically Sanskrit. So this really situates the Celts as a distinctly Western European branch of that great migration.
And within Britain itself, there were divisions.
Yes, deep divisions. Within the British context, the Celts were split into two primary linguistic branches, a dichotomy that we can trace deep into prehistory.
The first of these being the Goidelic Celts.
The Goidelic, or Q-Celts, yes.
Yeah.
These are the ancestors of the current speakers of Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx. They identified themselves nationally as Goidhel, which gives us the modern term Gael.
And the way they arrived is crucial for understanding how distinct they were. The prevailing theory suggests they used what's known as the Atlantic route.
That's right. The hypothesis is that they sailed up the western coast. They might have originated from the Iberian Peninsula or maybe the French Atlantic facade, and then moved directly into Ireland and the western fringes of Britain.
So a maritime route. This implies a more ancient, kind of slower diffusion, doesn't it? It's not like the later cross-channel invasions.
Precisely. And this model, it's supported by genetic markers that we find in Ireland and parts of western Scotland. They suggest a distinct and older population that, enjoyed centuries of relative isolation.
So chronologically, we can say with some certainty that the Goidels were the first Celtic speakers in Britain.
Undeniably. They preceded the Brythons by multiple centuries, and their geographical position really confirms this. They're confined primarily to the west and the north, sort of pushed against the Atlantic margins. It shows they were the earliest stratum of Celtic settlement to arrive on the island.
Which brings us to the second major group, the Brythonic or P-Celts.
Yes, and this group is absolutely foundational to Welsh, to Breton, and it also encompasses languages that are now extinct in Britain, like Cumbric and the language spoken by the Picts.
And this division is so critical because the Brythonic language was also the language of the ancient Gauls on the continent.
The very same. The ones the Romans collectively called the Galli or Celtae. The name Galli itself is often thought to mean warriors, which certainly fits the image that the classical writers gave them.
And their migration was very different from the Goidels.
Completely different. The Brythonic migration used the cross-channel route. We're talking about a massive wave of people crossing the narrowest part of the sea, likely beginning as early as, say, 1000 BC.
So a much more direct movement.
A direct invasion, really. The first major wave of these Gaulish invaders is generally believed to have established deep settlements across the south and east well before the mid-4th century BC.
And then there was another later group.
A distinct and later wave, yes. The Belgi, who came from northern Gaul. Now, in Caesar's time, their arrival was still considered recent, which gave them a slightly separate identity.
But linguistically, they were Brythonic.
They were, and so they ultimately became thoroughly merged into that wider Brythonic element, which came to dominate the vast majority of the island south of the River Forth.
So when we're approaching the social and political structure right before AD 43, we have to recognize a really complex demographic reality.
It's not simple at all. We are dealing with at least 4 distinct populations, all coexisting or layered on top of one another. You have the older Goidels.
The early Brythons, the aggressive and newer Belgic immigrants.
And, crucially, the underlying pre-Celtic people. The original inhabitants of the island, who, although they were subjugated, often heavily influenced the culture and especially the religion of the newcomers.
And the term Briton, or Brython in Welsh, that eventually became the generic name for this dominant P-Celtic population.
It did. But this complex layering of peoples creates a distinct problem for us when we try to reconcile the classical description of the Celts with the archaeological evidence from Britain itself.
The classical writers, especially those relying on accounts from Gaul, they uniformly describe the Celts as tall, immensely stalwart people, often noted for their fair or red hair.
And physical anthropology from Central Europe tends to support those observations. They were, by all accounts, visually distinct.
Yet the picture painted by the British archaeological record from the early Iron Age, the very period when these Brythonic conquerors should have been dominant, is quite different.
It's a real puzzle. Skeletons recovered from this period are mainly of small or middle-sized individuals. And critically, these remains often closely resemble the underlying Neolithic, the pre-Celtic races that occupied the island long before any Aryan incursions.
So that begs a fundamental question.
It really does. If the Brythonic invasion was this massive influx of tall, fair-haired conquerors, where is the physical evidence? The prevalent opinion in the research is that the initial Brythonic invasion, which brought ironworking technology, probably began around 400 BC.
So what does that discrepancy suggest?
It suggests that the Celtic identity, especially in the Iron Age South, may have been more about cultural and linguistic dominance than wholesale population replacement. The ruling elite might have been the classical Celtic type, sure, but they likely imposed their language and technology upon a much larger existing population base.
So we just don't have the definitive Celtic conquerors in the skeletal record.
We simply lack the evidence. Perhaps their burial sites, like the ones with war chariots, are just different from the continental cemeteries in Gaul. The evidence is either lost or, well, we haven't yet learned how to find it.
Let's move from the internal structure of the tribes to how they were perceived from the outside. The first written accounts of Britain come through Greek exploration.
And we have to begin with Pytheas, the intrepid explorer, astronomer, and mathematician from Marseille, who undertook his voyage around 330 BC.
And his expedition, it wasn't just for curiosity. It was a calculated commercial venture.
Absolutely. Pytheas's journey was funded by the wealthy merchant class of Marseille, which was then a Phocian Greek colony. Their goal was deeply strategic. They wanted to counter the growing dominance of Carthage over Western Mediterranean trade.
By finding new northern routes to valuable metals.
Exactly, particularly tin and amber. So Pytheas sailed around Spain, up the coast of Brittany, and then extensively charted the British coastline.
His route was monumental, really. He visited Kent and various other parts of Britain, and on his return, he sailed back past the Thames estuary, navigated the mouth of the Rhine, went past Jutland. He went as far east as the Vistula River.
This is not a casual raid. It suggests a meticulous, commercially backed reconnaissance, which he may have even repeated a second time.
And his observations about the southeast of the island are invaluable for understanding agriculture at that time.
Immensely valuable. Pytheas noted that the farmer was already thoroughly at home in the fertile areas opposite the continent. This is the 4th century BC.
And he saw a specific agricultural technique adapted to the climate.
He did. He saw that because of the lack of sufficient continuous sun needed for open-air threshing, the farmers would gather their corn sheaves into large barns for drying and threshing. This is key evidence of sophisticated, established farming, not just nomadic wandering.
He also documented their diet, their drinks.
Yes, he recorded 2 principal native drinks. The first was a mix of wheat and honey, which we can easily identify as mead, a tradition that persists in parts of Wales.
And the second was a fermented drink from barley.
Beer, essentially. The Greek writers who later referenced Pytheas's work used a term for this drink that is still recognizable as the Celtic word for beer, kurmi, or kuriu arwu. These details, they paint a picture of an agrarian society with surplus production enough to support specialized fermentation.
So our second key classical source is Posidonius, about 2 centuries later, a contemporary of Cicero.
Correct, and Posidonius extended his travels into the more remote parts of the island. He focused particularly on Beleriand, which is the district of Cornwall, already celebrated for its vital tin resources.
And his observations are a crucial contrast to what Pytheas saw in the wealthy southeast.
A very strong contrast. He described the dwellings in these more remote areas as mean, often built simply of reeds or wood. But his most significant detail is about food storage and preparation.
The underground pits.
Exactly. He noted the practice of harvesting by cutting only the ears of corn and then storing them in these subterranean pits. The corn was fetched daily and then dressed for food by quickly scorching it over a flame before it was winnowed and ground.
It's an ancient method, but remarkably persistent.
It is. History tells us this exact process was still known as late as the 18th century in the Western Isles of Scotland, the Hebrides. The contrast between the barn threshing of the southeast and the pit storage of the west, it just highlights the profound regional differences in material culture that persisted right into the Roman period.
And this detailed foundation now brings us to the moment. The whole geopolitical relationship shifted violently. The intrusion of Julius Caesar. Rome goes from being a distant market to a direct, tangible threat.
Starting with the campaigns of 55 and 54 BC, Caesar's initial invasion in 55 BC was driven by a mix of military pragmatism and political expediency.
He had two stated motivations.
He did. First, to punish the Britons for their repeated aid to the Gauls who were resisting Rome providing money, refuge. Second, and maybe more important for his political career, he wanted to ascertain the island's layout, its military potential, and its resources for future, more systematic exploitation.
And he famously complained about the difficulty of gathering reliable intelligence.
He did. He said only merchants knew the coastal areas, which led him to significantly underestimate the strength of the inland tribes.
But despite that perceived separation, the political reality was far more integrated than Caesar perhaps realized.
Oh, absolutely. While he was collecting his vessels at the port of the Morini, ambassadors from many British states arrived immediately. They promised submission, they offered hostages preemptively. This shows a rapid, intimate communication network between the leading British tribes and the continent.
Likely facilitated by the very merchants Caesar had dismissed.
It's very likely. And in a move to capitalize on these diplomatic openings, Caesar sent Commius the Atrebat ahead as an envoy.
Commius was a Belgic chieftain, a client king of Caesar's in Gaul.
Yes, and Caesar picked him because of his supposed fidelity and, critically, his great influence in southern Britain, where other Atrebates had settled.
But the British response was not what he expected.
Not at all. It was a clear act of defiance and a severe blow to Roman confidence. The moment Commius landed, he was arrested and put in bonds.
The invasion began shortly after that, around the 24th of August, with 2 legions, about 12,000 men.
And Caesar found his initial landing point was unfavorable. Steep cliffs, massed enemy forces. He had to coast about 7 Roman miles to find an open beach.
But the Britons were there waiting for him.
They were. The Romans faced immediate opposition from this formidable combination of British cavalry and their highly maneuverable charioteers. The Roman soldiers, they weren't accustomed to this style of warfare. They were thrown into confusion by the sudden speed and the psychological impact of the chariots.
They managed to get a foothold, though?
A small, bloody foothold. They forced a British retreat, but Caesar noted that the absence of his own cavalry, which had been delayed by weather, prevented him from turning that retreat into a decisive rout.
Peace negotiations began almost instantly. The Britons released Commius and sued for terms. But then disaster struck.
A major, unforeseen setback. A severe storm hit, forcing back the delayed cavalry ships, and catastrophically, it coincided with a full moon tide.
Which devastated the main fleet.
It did. War galleys that had been hauled ashore were filled with water and ruined. Transport ships at anchor were shattered. And while Caesar managed a Herculean effort to repair all but 12 vessels, the sheer scale of the disaster was obvious to the British chiefs. They saw vulnerability.
And their strategy shifted instantly from negotiation to calculated destruction.
Absolutely. They stopped sending the promised hostages and combined their tribal forces. They believed they could cut off the small Roman army entirely before winter set in.
Their first attack was very targeted.
Highly targeted. They assaulted a foraging Roman legion near the only remaining patch of standing corn, which the army needed to survive. The legion was surrounded and only managed a safe, tactical retreat because Caesar himself intervened directly and rapidly.
A final skirmish near the Roman camp resulted in a Roman victory.
A hollow victory. Because of the advancing Caesar, the fragile state of his ships, and the absolute need to return to Gaul with a bigger force, Caesar granted peace almost immediately. He demanded a tribute, double the hostages, and then he left.
He was there for less than a month and didn't advance more than a mile from his landing site.
And yet the Senate in Rome, eager for imperial glory, decreed 20 days of public thanksgiving.
So, recognizing his miscalculation, Caesar ordered extensive preparations for the next year's campaign. He focused specifically on building ships that were better suited for the channel's conditions.
He did. By the time he returned in June of 54 BC, he had nearly 600 new vessels, a total fleet of over 800 ships. He was carrying 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. The goal was simple: start earlier and ensure total success.
And the scale of this second invasion was so overwhelming that the Britons didn't even try to contest the landing.
No, they adopted a more advantageous defensive strategy, gathering inland, and this time their resistance was unified under a single powerful leader, Cassivellaunus.
King of the Catuvellauni north of the Thames.
Correct. He was universally acknowledged by the Allied states as their ablest and most tried general. He was given sole command, despite his history of conflict with many of the other tribes.
Caesar marched inland immediately, about 12 miles, and took a stronghold. But again, the sea played a role.
The curse of the sea was not done with him. News arrived that a devastating storm had wrecked 40 ships overnight. Caesar had to halt his advance, spend 10 critical days repairing the fleet and hauling all the ships into the defenses of his main camp.
So while that was happening, Cassivellaunus was preparing his main challenge.
His mastery of chariot warfare. The Cantuvellani were experts at these rapid, sudden movements. The chariots weren't just transports, they were mobile, terrifying weapons used to dash through Roman cohort formations, disrupting their disciplined lines.
And the fighters would dismount.
Yes, they were skilled at rushing a position, dismounting to fight hand-to-hand, and then remounting with speed to withdraw, often luring Roman cavalry into unfavorable terrain where the legions couldn't support them.
So after securing his fleet, Caesar recommenced his advance and crossed the Thames.
With great difficulty, yes, probably upstream from modern London. At this point, Cassivellaunus realized a direct confrontation was impossible. He shifted tactics dramatically.
He kept 4,000 chariots.
Just to harass the Roman march, and crucially, to clear the countryside of resources. It was a scorched earth strategy, a constant small-scale harassment that limited the area the Romans could devastate.
A sound military strategy, but it failed because of politics.
Political fragmentation. The powerful Trinovantes tribe in Essex and Middlesex, they had a profound grievance against Cassivellaunus for killing their previous king. They saw the Romans as a tool for internal revenge.
So they sent envoys to Caesar.
They did, seeking peace and requesting the return of Mandubricius, the son of their slain king, who had fled to Caesar for protection.
And Caesar immediately leveraged this internal conflict.
Of course. He complied, demanded 40 hostages and a guaranteed supply of corn, but also promised to protect their territory from his own soldiers. This created an irresistible precedent.
The other tribes started to defect.
One after another. The Cenemani, Secontiaci, Ancolites, Bibroci, and Cassiol, likely Belgic tribes near the Thames. They feared Cassivellaunus more than they feared Roman occupation, and they saw Caesar as a powerful, if temporary, ally.
And with intelligence from these defectors, Caesar was able to storm Cassivellaunus's main stronghold.
A large wood fortified with a rampart and trench. He captured a significant number of people and cattle. Cassivellaunus, in a final, desperate move, ordered 4 local kings in Kent to storm the Roman coastal camp.
An attack that was swiftly repelled.
With heavy British losses. So, having exhausted his military options and facing internal revolt, Cassivellaunus sued for peace through Commios.
And Caesar, hearing rumors of trouble back in Gaul, agreed.
He did. He demanded a heavy yearly tribute, double the hostages, and departed near the equinox. He'd stayed for about 2 months, and he took with him hostages and a great number of captives for the slave markets in Rome, ensuring a solid economic return.
With Caesar's departure, we enter a century of, well, profound historical obscurity. The years until Claudius's invasion in AD 43 lack continuous narrative accounts.
Which is why, to reconstruct the complex political dynamics of late Celtic Britain, we have to rely almost entirely on the material evidence from numismatics, the study of the coins.
The story of British coinage begins with the gold stater of Philip II of Macedon, a coin with the head of Apollo and a charioteer.
Yes, and that prototype reached Gaul through the Greek colony of Massilia in the late 4th century BC. The fact that this currency was adopted shows a deep connection to Mediterranean trade routes long before the Roman military arrived.
And British gold coinage, modeled on the Gallic imitations, began circulating between 200 and 150 BC, first appearing in Kent.
What's fascinating is the evolution, or really the degeneration of the design over time. Through successive copying isolated from the Greek originals, the design became highly stylized. The Apollo head devolved into a simple cruciform pattern. The charioteer was reduced to a series of pellets. The horse became a grotesque figure.
It tells a story of cultural isolation, where the form was kept, but the original artistic intent was lost.
Precisely. And before Caesar, these coins were overwhelmingly uninscribed. But the political shockwave of the conquest of Gaul changed that very quickly.
Lettered coins appear.
Yes, using Latin formulas and often adopting clear Roman design cues. They appeared soon after 54 BC, again, first in Kent. This transformation marks the beginning of explicit Roman diplomatic and economic influence.
But coinage wasn't universal.
Not at all. Caesar reported that some inland tribes used alternative forms of currency, specifically iron or bronze bars of a fixed weight, and archaeology strongly corroborates this.
These are the iron currency bars.
Yes, shaped to look like swords but far too heavy for combat. We find them in central and western counties, at sites like Glastonbury and Hod Hill. They were meticulously organized into specific weight ratios, a non-monetary system of exchange. Their absence in the East, where coinage was prevalent, confirms a strong regional economic disparity.
And using these lettered coins, we can trace the rapid dynastic shifts that defined this century. The Commian family in the south, for example.
The irony there is incredible. Commius the Atrebat started as Caesar's client, became a fierce anti-Roman leader in Gaul, and then fled to Britain. Research suggests he became the head of a Belgic league explicitly organized to resist the expansionism of the Catuvellauni.
His political legacy was solidified by his sons.
Tincomios, Verica, and Apilos. They issued some of the first clearly lettered coins around 30 BC, adopting Latin formulas like tinc, Commiefkin Commios, son of Commios.
It's a direct assimilation of Roman administrative style.
It is. Apilos eventually established himself as king of Caliva, which later became Silchester. The fact that coinage in this area ceases after their reign suggests a military conquest, almost certainly by their primary rival.
The Catuvellauni, the dominant military and political force leading up to AD 43.
Their name itself, possibly meaning battle rulers or war kings, suggests an aggressive expansionist policy. They were centered originally at Verlemion or St. Albans, but their ascendancy was cemented under Tatiovanus and his son, Cunobelinos.
Shakespeare's Cymbeline.
The historical basis for him, yes. And Cunobelinos completely reshaped the political landscape. He established his capital at Camulodunum on Colchester, deep within the territory of the Trinovantes. This was a tangible sign of conquest.
Displacing the successor to Mandubratius.
Dubnivelanos, yes. By the time of his death, Cunobelinos had forced many southern princes into submission or unequal alliances. History tells us his rule was so dominant that the Romans themselves called him Rex Britannorum, the king of the Britons.
And the sheer dominance of the Catuvellauni created a very volatile political ecosystem among the surrounding tribes. The Iceni are a clear example.
A hardy, warlike race in what's now Norfolk and Suffolk. And interestingly, their coinage largely resisted Roman artistic influence, suggesting a deliberate maintenance of their own culture.
But despite that independence, they were profoundly wary of the Catuvellauni.
Which is the primary context for their actions in AD 43. They sought an alliance with Rome without ever having to fight. The research indicates that before the Romans arrived, the Iceni state was undergoing significant internal political instability.
Possibly a revolution that had dissolved the traditional monarchy.
And replaced it with a fiercely divided oligarchy. This instability likely centered on two figures, Berikos and Antidrigas. Berikos, one of the leaders, was expelled in an uprising, and crucially, he fled directly to Emperor Claudius
And persuaded him to launch the full-scale invasion.
by promising the immediate strategic assistance of the Iceni. And this isn't an isolated incident, it reflects a systemic collapse of independence across the South.
Dubnivelanos, the earlier prince from the Trinovantes, was recorded on Augustan inscriptions as seeking the emperor's protection.
It's a recurring pattern. Influential, exiled British kings, Mendubratios, Dubnivelanos, Berikos, all seeking Roman military intervention to settle internal scores. This provided Claudius with the perfect pretext and opportunity for conquest.
This political turmoil stands in stark contrast to the increasing sophistication of the material world in late Celtic Britain. Strabo noted a significant economic shift after Caesar's incursions.
The exports were no longer just incidental. They included staples like corn and cattle, valuable resources like gold, silver, and importantly, iron, which was now abundant enough to be an export commodity.
And also skins, slaves, and war dogs.
Yes, highly prized by the Gauls. The imports, conversely, were largely luxury items: ivory rings, ornamental necklaces, red amber, fine glassware. This exchange profile indicates a robust, commercially savvy connection with the Roman world.
And the tin trade, which first drew Pythias centuries earlier, exemplifies this level of industrial organization.
Posidonius described the process in detail. The tin was smelted, purified, cast into slabs shaped like knuckle bones, and then transported in wagons at low tide to the island of Ictus, probably Thanet.
For sale to continental merchants, the logistics for that must have been impressive.
A 30-day overland journey through Gaul to the Rhone. It suggests a far more developed system of production and distribution than is often assumed for Iron Age societies.
This trade relied on shipping, though it was largely controlled by the Gauls. But native British shipbuilding certainly existed.
It did. And we can look at the sophisticated Veneti fleet, which Caesar defeated in 56 BC. Those were true seagoing craft, large, high-standing ships of solid oak, with decks a foot thick, fastened with iron bolts and sails of stiff hides.
They represented the pinnacle of northern shipbuilding technology.
And likely served as a pattern for later Roman military vessels in British waters. But in sharp contrast, the native craft Caesar personally saw were the light coracles, simple frames of lath covered with hides.
Crucial for coastal and inland navigation, and a design that persisted for centuries.
Remarkably so. And overland traffic relied on ancient trackways, like the Pilgrim's Way, running along ridges to avoid the dense forests and marshes. These prehistoric paths had to be significantly improved to accommodate wheeled traction, not just for war chariots, but for the heavy tin wagons.
So the material evidence points to an advanced, organized industrial life.
Absolutely. Iron mining was well established before the conquest in the Wealden Forest and probably the Forest of Dean. And as Strabo confirms, it had become an export commodity by the early 1st century AD.
Agriculture was also highly advanced. Caesar's ability to requisition enough corn from the Trinovantes to supply 4 legions is proof of that.
And we find the tools to back it up. Iron sickles, plowshares, evidence of terrace cultivation on the Sussex Downs, and an abundance of Corin's handmills at settlements like Hunsbury, suggesting every household could process its own grain.
And then there's the subterranean engineering in the southeast.
The Dean holes. These famous chalk pits in Kent, Essex, and Norfolk are best explained as essential agricultural infrastructure. They were primarily granaries for long-term corn storage, protecting the harvest from damp and pests.
But they also served as refuges.
And the excavated chalk was used to manure the surrounding fields, completing a symbiotic agricultural system.
So by the time of the Claudian invasion, the concept of centralized settlement, even nascent urbanization, was emerging.
Yes, pre-conquest tribal centers like Camulodunum and Verulamium had their own mints, signifying political and economic centrality. Caleva, or Silchester, was the heavily fortified capital of the Atrebates.
But the older hill forts were still highly relevant.
Many were still permanently occupied, serving as established residential areas, and we see varied architectural solutions. Whorlbury is a rare stone fort, unique for lacking a ditch. Winklebury had carefully engineered openings in its ramparts specifically for moving cattle quickly, and Bigbury is likely the fortified wood stronghold described by Caesar himself.
Hunsbury is a prime example of a specialized industrial and defensive settlement.
Small, only 4 acres, but heavily fortified. It contained around 300 pits for storage or refuge. And crucially, Hunsbury showed clear evidence of specialized industry smelting, weaving, pottery, but with no trace of Roman influence, positioning it firmly as a late Celtic settlement.
And in terms of military architecture, we even see some sophisticated fortifications combining timber and stone.
Similar to the Murus Gallicus, the Gaulish walls Caesar described, examples have been found as far north as Birdhead and Castlellaw in Scotland, showing a sophisticated engineering knowledge adapted from continental models.
This technological advancement was matched by a highly distinct aesthetic culture, late Celtic art, which reached its zenith in the British Isles.
An outgrowth of the continental Latin culture, it's fundamentally defined by the curve, which is in profound opposition to the geometric chevron patterns of the earlier Bronze Age.
The technique involved transforming natural forms, like foliage or animals, into highly conventionalized, abstract representations.
And integrating them into these complex, beautiful, sinuous lines. The final result is highly abstract, dynamic, and has often been compared aesthetically to the flamboyant tracery of later Gothic architecture.
They used striking and imported materials to maximize the effect. Coral, for example.
Sourced from the Mediterranean. And it was prized in Britain far later than it was on the continent. And even more so, the use of enamel was a hallmark of their sophisticated metalwork.
And before the conquest, red was the only color used.
Applied through the Champlevé process, where a depression was carved out of the metal to create a bed for the fused enamel, which significantly enhanced its brilliance and durability.
We see this artistry preserved on numerous surviving artifacts, bronze swords, scabbards, and especially the bronze mirrors.
The mirror from Trelan Bahau in Cornwall is a particularly beautiful example. It's ornamented on its back with intricate engraved scrollwork and delicate cross-hatching, demonstrating a mastery of detailed surface decoration.
But the most profound representation of this aesthetic is arguably the bronze shield recovered from the Thames.
A noble creation. Oblong, adorned with 3 circular bosses of repoussé work, connected by flowing lines. And within the circles, smaller elements enclose complex enamel designs with swastika motifs and SC-shaped curves. It's a testament to the technical skill and artistic vision of the late Celtic craftsmen.
And this aesthetic extended to personal appearance.
Britons were noted for their long hair and prominent mustaches while shaving the rest of the face and body. They wore tunics, cloaks fastened with brooches, and trousers or breeches, often made of many-colored cloths, suggesting patterns similar to modern tartan.
A well-equipped chieftain would have been a splendid barbarian.
Whose military gear was also undeniably a work of high art.
But as we transition from material culture to the societal framework, we see that Britain, while achieving high levels of artistic and economic sophistication, was politically in a more rudimentary stage compared to Gaul.
Yes, and revolutionary forces were clearly at work undermining traditional structures. The Celts were historically ruled by kings, similar to the heroic monarchs described by Homer, believed to reign by divine right.
But in Gaul, by Caesar's time, this system had largely been replaced by oligarchies of powerful chiefs.
In Britain, however, the monarchy was not yet extinct. It certainly persisted among the Catuvillani and the Brigantes. Yet in the southeast, in Kent, Caesar encountered a distinct deviation. He dealt with 4 separate kings acting collectively under the military authority of Cassivellaunus.
Which suggests a divergence from traditional hereditary rule.
Exactly. It indicates that new shared power structures, perhaps temporary military commands or nascent oligarchies, were emerging, similar to what had already happened in Gaul.
And beneath these ruling classes, the common people were in a state approaching semi-serfdom.
To get any protection against the powerful noblemen, they often entered into a client relationship, bound by debt. This system echoes the position of the early plebeians in Rome and was a direct result of the subjugation of the pre-Aryan population by the incoming Celtic conquerors.
Interestingly, this patriarchal system coexisted with notable examples of female sovereignty.
Which contrasts sharply with some Gallic customs. We know of women who held supreme power, like Cartismandua of the Brigantes, and later Boudica of the Iceni. This stands in opposition to the Gallic custom where the husband possessed the power of life and death over his wife and children.
The religious landscape was profoundly shaped by the Druids. Caesar himself recorded the tradition that Druidism originated in Britain.
The probability, however, based on the non-Aryan elements in their philosophy and rites, suggests that the Celts in both lands adopted this highly organized religious structure from the underlying Aboriginal inhabitants.
And the Druids were far more than priests.
They formed a highly structured, self-contained corporation. They were exempt from taxation and war service. Crucially, they held a complete monopoly on learning and acted as judges in almost all civil and criminal cases.
Their immense power was derived from their ability to exercise excommunication.
The most feared penalty, which effectively excluded an individual entirely from the civil and religious community, rendering them an outcast.
And their philosophical tenets were fundamental to the Celtic military ethos.
Their most critical doctrine was the emphasis on the transmigration of souls. This belief was presented as the most potent incentive to valor in combat because it fostered a profound contempt for death. The soul would simply move on to a new body.
But historical accounts also detail the cruel nature of their rites.
Tacitus records that the Druids of Mona Anglesey practiced barbaric rituals, staining their altars with human blood and seeking auguries from the entrails of their victims. They also immolated victims in monstrous figures made of wicker work.
This influence varied geographically.
It did. In the north, they were still primarily seen as magicians and soothsayers. But in the more civilized southeast, likely due to influence from Mediterranean centers, the Druids had begun to take on the character of philosophers, instructing youth on astronomy, natural science, and complex doctrines about the gods.
And the Celts maintained a polytheistic faith.
Though our knowledge is largely filtered through the lens of Roman syncretism, the tendency of Roman writers to equate Celtic gods with their own.
So Mercury was equated with the Celtic godlug.
Widely believed to be, yes. His name survives in place names like Carlisle, Lubuvalum, and Lians, Lugudunum. Mars was also deeply revered in Britain, appearing with Celtic epithets like Camulus, god of heaven, and Tutats, god of the people.
Jupiter was equated with Tanarus, the thunderer.
And this may link directly to the widespread worship of the wheel symbol, which is often suggested to symbolize sun worship. Another foundational deity was Dispater, the god of the dead, whom the Gauls claimed as their ultimate ancestor.
And among the minor but intensely popular deities were the mother goddesses.
The Deimitris, almost universally represented in gentle, maternal groups of 3, holding infants or bearing fruit. They were extremely popular among the common country folk.
And evidence of animal worship also persisted.
The boar was particularly sacred. We find bronze figures of boars on helmets, standards, and the Wittem shield, underscoring its significance. Worship was also given to local spirits of rivers, springs, and woods. The world was intensely personified, even extending to diseases like the Yellow Death. The material advancements and the highly sophisticated art of late Celtic Britain, exemplified by the intricate craftsmanship of the Trilon Bajo mirror and the technical brilliance of the Thames shield, existed in profound and fatal conjunction with a fundamental failure to achieve sustained political unity against external pressures. The relentless internal wars, the Catuvellauni's constant aggressions, and the recurring flight of multiple princes, Mandubraccios, Dubnofalanos, and Bericos, who sought Roman military intervention to settle their domestic scores, collectively provided Claudius with the unimpeachable pretext and opportunity for invasion in AD 43. The coexistence of such high cultural sophistication with systemic political collapse raises an important question regarding the fundamental internal preconditions necessary for a society to maintain its independence against a unified, expansive external power.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.